The night air over the Rhine carried the smell of diesel and damp earth, a cold March wind cutting through the darkness like a blade. It was March 23, 1945, just past 9 in the evening, and across the black waters of Germany's sacred river, a German observer named Wilhelm Steinberg pressed binoculars against his face, hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he was seeing. Through the gathering fog and artillery smoke, he could make out thousands of American guns lined up along the western bank, their barrels pointing east like accusing fingers. He scribbled notes in a field journal that would later be found in a dusty file at captured Army Group headquarters, his handwriting tight and precise. "The Americans have reached the Rhine," he wrote, "but they cannot cross it. No army in history has ever forced this river against German steel without bridges." 2,000 years of German history stood behind that belief. The Rhine wasn't just water and current. It was mythology. It was protection. It was the line between survival and annihilation. German commanders had spent months preparing for this moment, positioning their 88mm guns along the heights, calculating fields of fire, measuring angles and distances. They knew the Americans would come, knew they'd throw everything they had at the crossing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the rules of river warfare were about to be rewritten by something so simple, so unglamorous, that German intelligence had dismissed it as barely worth mentioning in their reports. Across the river, hidden in forests and staging areas just beyond German sight, 2,000 Scottish soldiers from the 51st Highland Division stood beside vehicles that looked like someone had welded a boat hull onto a truck chassis and called it a day. These were DUKWs, amphibious trucks that German analysts had seen before in Normandy and Italy, but had filed away in their minds as specialized beach equipment. Interesting, but irrelevant to the real war. The mathematics seemed clear to every German officer who'd studied the problem. The Rhine was 1,300 feet wide at the crossing points. Its current ran swift and cold, and any attempt to bridge it would take days under fire. Days in which German artillery could systematically destroy pontoon sections, days in which infantry and assault boats would be sitting ducks, days in which the natural fortress of the river would do what castles and concrete couldn't: stop the Allied advance cold. But mathematics only work when you know all the variables, and German intelligence had miscalculated catastrophically. The strange boat trucks they'd dismissed were about to turn Germany's last natural barrier into a highway, and the men who'd spent months preparing the Rhine's defense were about to learn that American industrial ingenuity could be more devastating than any wonder weapon. The collapse had begun months earlier in rooms where German intelligence officers sorted through reports and photographs, trying to make sense of Allied capabilities. They'd seen the swimming trucks in Sicily, watched them operate at Salerno, observed them shuttling supplies across Normandy's beaches. But every time a report crossed a desk mentioning these amphibious vehicles, analysts made the same fatal assumption: they projected their own limitations onto the enemy. Germany had developed its own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper, and it was in many ways superior to the American DUKW, better armored, more capable in rough terrain, engineered with the precision that German craftsmen took pride in. But Germany had produced only about 100 of them, and the analysts assumed that any amphibious vehicle program would face similar constraints: specialized components, skilled labor, limited production capacity. The idea that America could produce such vehicles in the thousands, that they could organize entire companies of amphibious trucks and train crews to use them not as support equipment, but as primary assault vehicles, that simply didn't fit into the German understanding of how war worked. A captured diary from Major Hans Model, son of the famous field marshal, would later reveal the depth of German confidence. "The Rhine will give us time," he'd written. "Time to regroup, time to negotiate, time for the miracle weapons to make a difference." His father's officers, veterans who'd fought across Russia and France, men who understood river warfare from the Dnieper to the Seine, They all believed the same thing. Rivers were barriers that attackers had to overcome in stages, methodically, predictably. First came the artillery bombardment, then infantry would cross in vulnerable assault boats, establishing small footholds under fire. Engineers would work frantically to construct bridges, while defenders concentrated fire on the obvious crossing points. Only after days of brutal fighting could armor cross, and even then the bridges would be choke points, targets that a few well-placed shells could close. That's how it had always worked. That's what every manual taught, every exercise practiced. The Allies would need overwhelming superiority, time, and luck. What German intelligence never detected was the massive buildup of amphibious capability happening just beyond their observation posts. By March of 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs were operating in the European theater, organized into specialized companies with trained crews who'd been practicing river crossings for months. The British had received 2,000 more through Lend-Lease. The Canadians operated 800 with cold weather modifications. This wasn't a small, specialized force. This was an entire amphibious army that German reconnaissance had somehow missed. Intelligence officer Hermann Friedrich Wenzel had compiled reports on Allied equipment for 6 months. And in all those documents, the DUKW appeared exactly 3 times. 3 mentions in half a year, each one dismissing the vehicles as coastal operations equipment with no relevance to river warfare. His reports estimated the Americans possessed maybe 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater. The reality was 40 times that number, and they were all rolling toward the Rhine. The DUKW itself was born from American problem-solving at its most pragmatic. In April of 1942, a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar off Cape Cod, and conventional trucks couldn't reach it through the surf. That minor incident, that small problem on a Massachusetts beach, sparked an idea that would help end the Third Reich. A designer named Palmer Putnam partnered with yacht architect Rod Stevens and engineer Dennis Pauliston to imagine a vehicle that could drive on roads and swim through water without stopping. When Ford said it couldn't be done in the required time frame, General Motors took the challenge and delivered a working prototype in just 38 days. The vehicle combined a standard GMC truck chassis with a watertight hull, added a propeller and rudder, installed a revolutionary tire inflation system that let drivers adjust pressure on the move, and painted it olive drab. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. By war's end, GMC had manufactured over 21,000 of them at a pace of more than 500 per month. Each one cost about $10,000, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps. And each one could carry 25 fully equipped soldiers or 2.5 tons of supplies across water, and then drive them inland without stopping. While German engineers were handcrafting amphibious masterpieces in limited numbers, American factories were stamping out swimming trucks like loaves of bread. And German intelligence never noticed the difference. March arrived with Germany's Rhine defenses looking formidable on paper, but hollow underneath. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, once the elite of German forces, had been bled white in the Reichswald battles. 90,000 casualties that couldn't be replaced. The replacements arriving to defend the sacred river were Volkssturm units, old men and teenagers with a few weeks of training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of proper uniforms. A sergeant named Otto Kraus wrote to his wife from his position near Wesel, trying to convince himself as much as her. "The Americans are across from us," he wrote. "Thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon couldn't cross the Rhine against opposition." German defensive preparations looked impressive if you didn't look too closely. 200,000 civilian laborers had spent months strengthening fortifications, building 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions. The river itself was 1,300 feet of fast-moving water, too wide for assault bridges, too swift for easy boat crossings, too deep for fording. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding in the west after Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that revealed how completely German commanders misunderstood what was coming. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads, he wrote. This window provides opportunity for counterattack. Those counterattacks would be launched by 47th Panzer Corps, which possessed about 150 operational armored vehicles to cover nearly 200 miles of front. The mathematics of desperation. But the most critical German failure wasn't in numbers or positions, it was conceptual. Every German officer understood river crossings as a sequence of vulnerable phases. Artillery bombardment, infantry assault in boats, small bridgeheads under fire, bridge construction while under attack, gradual reinforcement, and finally armor crossing after bridges were complete. Each phase gave defenders time to react, concentrate fire, launch counterattacks. That's how rivers were crossed. That's what doctrine taught. That's what history showed. What they didn't know, what kept German commanders sleeping soundly in those final nights before the assault, was that hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed assembly areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed and inspected, loaded with specific cargo calculated to maintain water stability. Crews had practiced on the Maas River for 2 weeks, learning how to handle fast current, how to calculate drift, how to coordinate with artillery fire so they didn't get hit by their own shells. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding an amphibious truck company, understood what his men were about to do. "This isn't Normandy with tides and beach obstacles," he told them. "The Rhine is about current, about exit points, about moving fast enough that the Germans can't target you." The vehicles had been modified based on 3 years of combat experience. Armor plating protected drivers and engines. Machine gun mounts provided self-defense. Specialized pumps could handle water intake from small arms fire, so the DUKWs could keep operating even with holes in their hulls. At a final briefing, a captain named James Mitchell told his men something that must have sounded like fantasy. "We're going to do something nobody has ever done," he said. "Use DUKWs as primary assault vehicles for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after bridges are built, but the actual spearhead. Each duck will carry a full rifle squad, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions. No stopping, no transferring to other vehicles, just drive through the river like it's a road." The British had their own amphibious assets, 600 Buffalo tractors that could carry 30 men each. But it was the American DUKWs, with their ability to seamlessly transition from water to land, that would prove most devastating to German assumptions. At 5 in the evening on March 23rd, the artillery bombardment began. 4,000 Allied guns from 25-pounders to massive 240mm howitzers unleashed a barrage that turned the air solid. German observers trying to count muzzle flashes gave up after 500. The western bank looked like a continuous line of flame stretching north and south to the horizon. The noise wasn't individual explosions anymore, it was one continuous roar that made thinking impossible, that turned the eastern bank into a boiling cauldron of earth and steel. A German observer named Heinrich Müller tried to describe it later. "Not individual explosions," he said, "but one continuous roar that made thought impossible." Under cover of that bombardment and the darkness it created, the 1st DUKWs entered the Rhine at 9 p.m. The 51st Highland Division's Black Watch Battalion led the way. 12 fully equipped Scottish soldiers in each vehicle, plus the 2-man American crew. Navigation lights shielded to be visible only from behind marked entry and exit points. A sergeant named Robert McPherson described what it felt like. "We rolled down the bank and suddenly we were floating," he said. "The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The engine noise was terrific. German shells were hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke." The Rhine's current ran faster than expected. 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUKW drivers launched upstream of their intended landing points, calculating drift like pilots in crosswind, letting the current carry them while the propeller pushed them across. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but it didn't matter because they could drive up any reasonably sloped bank, exit wherever they found themselves, and keep moving. By 10 p.m., the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for second waves, heard nothing but the continued artillery thunder. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and disappeared into the darkness, their passengers already engaging German positions from unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that made no sense. Enemy troops appearing miles inland from expected crossing points, in battalion strength, with heavy weapons. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads under pressure hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. A German battery commander named Karl Richter radioed back to headquarters, his voice tight with confusion. "Enemy armor is behind us," he reported. "Repeat, enemy armor is behind our position." "How did they get across?" "All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction." What Richter had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars and machine guns and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland, bypassing German strongpoints positioned to defend obvious routes from the riverbank. As morning fog lifted, the scale became clear. Hundreds of DUKWs shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams, not at 6 or 8 prepared crossing points, but at dozens of locations along a 20-mile front. Unlike assault boats that required perpendicular crossings at fixed sites, DUKWs could enter and exit anywhere the banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing everywhere, their guns unable to engage so many targets simultaneously. A major named Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets." At 10 a.m., the thunder of aircraft engines added to the cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, began as 1,700 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders appeared over the Rhine, carrying 16,000 paratroopers. This wasn't the isolated drop German doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work with the amphibious assault. A German soldier named Franz Weber watched from his position. "The sky turned black with aircraft," he said later. "Parachutes bloomed like flowers, thousands upon thousands. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The airborne forces landed within artillery range of the Rhine, something German commanders hadn't anticipated. Previous airborne operations dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines to operate independently. This time they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove straight to airborne positions. Wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs returning to the western bank. A paratrooper named Donald Burgett remembered these weird-looking truck boats coming out of the woods. "No splashing, no bogging down," he said. "They just drove up like regular trucks, except we knew they'd crossed the Rhine." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were hallucinating. By noon on March 24th, just 15 hours after the first DUKW entered the water, the full implications became clear. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated every assumption in German defensive planning. Traditional crossings required sequential vulnerable phases. The DUKWs eliminated those vulnerabilities. No waiting for bridge construction, no unloading at riverbanks, no transfer between vehicles. Vehicles loaded on the western bank simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. A logistics officer named George Sims had established what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine. "We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point," he reported. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies, or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies, or 1,250 troops every hour around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through water. The psychological impact was devastating. A German sergeant named Hermann Goetz wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported surreal experiences. A technical sergeant named Anthony Russo described establishing a supply dump 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side. "Here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers," he said. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane. By March 25th, German commanders faced a situation Wehrmacht doctrine had never addressed. The Rhine hadn't been conquered or breached. It had simply become irrelevant through American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a curiosity. General Schlemm held a commanders' conference that morning, and the surviving record reveals the depth of German dismay. "Gentlemen," Schlemm reportedly said, "we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it." The numbers were staggering. In 48 hours, DUKWs had transported 15,000 troops across the Rhine. More critically, they'd moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps and trucks and light armor that traditional methods wouldn't have delivered for days. Artillery pieces were firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence confirmed the crossings had occurred. A panzer commander named Hinrich von Luttwitz attempted to counterattack near Wesel on March 25th. His unit's diary records the confusion. "Attacked toward river to destroy enemy bridgehead," it reads. "Found no bridgehead in traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across 15-kilometer front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses. The Rhine crossing starkly exposed. The industrial asymmetry between American mass production and German craftsmanship philosophy. Germany's Landwasserschlepper was superior in many ways to the DUKW, better armored, more capable, an impressive piece of engineering. But Germany had produced only about 100 units. Meanwhile, General Motors had manufactured 21,000 DUKWs using existing truck components and assembly line methods. The DUKW shared its engine, transmission, axles, and countless other parts with standard trucks, of which over 500,000 were built. Any mechanic could maintain a DUKW. Spare parts were abundant. Damaged vehicles were quickly repaired. A maintenance sergeant named Edwin Coleman explained the advantage. "We kept 90% of our DUKWs operational throughout the crossing," he said. "When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have parts, we could adapt something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some specialized German wonder weapon." The production philosophy extended beyond numbers. American DUKWs were designed for ease of operation. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in hours. American. Mass production assumed operators would be citizen soldiers with minimal training. German design assumed professional soldiers with months of preparation. A private named James Harper recalled his first sight of the DUKWs. "We were expecting to crowd into assault boats under fire, like we'd trained," he said. "Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down. A Navy guy, Yeah, Navy, in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The presence of U.S. Navy personnel operating DUKWs deep in Germany added to German confusion. A seaman named Robert Moody described capturing some Germans who just stared at Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, "How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away." He simply couldn't process what he was seeing. German accounts reveal progressive demoralization. A lieutenant named Friedrich Schulze wrote, in a captured letter, "They came across the river like it was a street, not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barrages, but driving. Trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more." A captured soldier named Paul Braun told interrogators, "We were told the EEV, Rhine would stop you for weeks, that you would have to build bridges we would destroy. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war." By March 26th, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had collapsed completely. What Wehrmacht doctrine insisted would take weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Rhine barrier, which propaganda claimed would hold until negotiations could save something of the Reich, had evaporated. DUKWs had completed over 5,000. Individual crossings transported 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations would have needed 2 weeks to achieve similar throughput, while under constant attack. Field Marshal Montgomery's after-action report noted with British understatement, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it." The distinction proved fatal to their defense. General Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26th and watched DUKWs streaming back and forth like a ferry service. He turned to Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." Joseph Goebbels' diary entry for March 26th captured the psychological collapse. "The situation in the West has become impossible," he wrote. "The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." March 27th saw full exploitation of the breakthrough. The 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been fed across in record time. Tank crews described following DUKWs that had just emerged from the Rhine, still dripping water as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to advancing tank units, eliminating the traditional pause for supply buildup after a river crossing. Major General Isaac White, commanding 2nd Armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27th alone. In any previous operation, we would have been waiting for bridges to be completed and supplies to be stockpiled. Instead, the DUKWs kept pace with us. They'd cross rivers we encountered, scout for crossing sites, establish supply points before our main body arrived. German resistance crumbled into isolated pockets. Units prepared to counterattack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. The rigid German defensive doctrine based on identifying and destroying fixed crossing points had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles creating their own crossing points at will. A colonel named Hans von Luck encountered American forces near Dorsten on March 28th. His memoir describes the meeting. "My battalion was racing to establish a blocking position when we encountered American troops already dug in," he wrote. "I asked a captured lieutenant how they had moved so quickly. He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' It was then I truly understood Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost an entire form of warfare. The full impact of the DUKW extended beyond impressive statistics. The amphibious trucks had fundamentally altered the mathematics of river assault, creating advantages that compounded exponentially. Traditional crossings concentrated forces at specific points, creating targets for artillery. The DUKWs dispersed. Crossings along the entire front, diluting German firepower. Wehrmacht doctrine called for counter-attacking bridgeheads before they could consolidate. But there were no traditional bridgeheads, just continuous infiltration across a broad front. A colonel named William Thompson calculated the time savings. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire typically took 12 to 24 hours minimum, he said. During that time, you could only reinforce by assault boat, maybe a company per hour if things went well. We were moving a battalion per hour with DUKWs from the first minute of the operation. The medical impact was profound. A nurse named Dorothy Anderson described the evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven directly to our hospital on the western side, she said. No transfer between vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded. That simply wasn't possible in traditional river crossings. The DUKWs also enabled tactical innovations impossible with conventional methods. Artillery forward observers could relocate rapidly, making German counter-battery fire ineffective. Engineers used DUKWs to transport bridge sections, actually accelerating traditional bridge construction even as they made it less critical. Radio relay stations in DUKWs maintained communications across the water barrier. Post-war analysis revealed the depth of German intelligence failure. The Wehrmacht had observed DUKWs in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, yet never grasped their strategic implications. A general named Reinhard Gehlen admitted in his memoirs, "We catalogued American equipment meticulously. We knew about the DUKWs. We simply never imagined they would mass hundreds of them for a river crossing. Our thinking was constrained by our own limitations. Because we could only produce a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans faced similar constraints." Captured intelligence files revealed systematic underestimation. A February 1945 assessment estimated Allied forces possessed approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. The actual number was over 2,000. German intelligence never identified the specialized amphibious truck companies, never detected their training exercises, never recognized the doctrinal revolution underway. An intelligence officer named Joachim Engelmann testified after capture. "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido to the Seine," he said. "We thought we understood their methods. The massed employment of amphibious vehicles simply wasn't in our calculations. It was as if they had developed the ability to fly tanks across the river, completely outside our frame of reference. Despite tactical and technological superiority, the crossing was not bloodless. Allied casualties for the operation totaled nearly 7,000, almost 4,000 British and Commonwealth, over 2,800 American. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430, killed in a single day. DUKWs evacuating wounded came under German artillery fire, with several vehicles lost with all aboard. A combat engineer named Oskar Friedensen described his unit's crossing. "We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to establish our sector," he said. "The DUKWs got us across fast, but the Germans were waiting on high ground with machine guns and mortars. Speed doesn't make you bulletproof." German casualties were catastrophic. The First Parachute Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 16,000 prisoners were captured in 72 hours, many simply abandoning positions once they realized the Rhine barrier had failed. A soldier named Werner Hoffmann, captured on March 25th, revealed the psychological impact during interrogation. "We held our positions for 2 days firing at crossing sites," he said. "Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked prisoners how they crossed, they pointed at those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant threw down his weapon and said, 'If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is over.'" Nobody disagreed. On March 25th, Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on personally crossing the Rhine. This wasn't mere theatrics. Churchill understood the historical significance of Allied armies crossing Germany's sacred river. First, he observed crossings from a demolished railway bridge at Wesel, then against urgent advice from his security detail and Eisenhower's explicit orders, Churchill boarded an American landing craft and crossed to the eastern bank. An aide named Trumbull Warren recorded the scene. "The PM was absolutely determined," he said. "He said, 'I'm going to cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment.'" The American crew was horrified when they realized who their passenger was, but Churchill was already aboard, cigar clamped in teeth, making V for victory signs. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Rhine, while German artillery shells landed close enough to spray the party with debris. Churchill reportedly picked up a handful of earth and said, "German soil, at last." The crossing was militarily unnecessary and risky, but psychologically powerful. The leader of Britain standing on conquered German territory. The incident revealed another advantage of the amphibious assault. Churchill could cross because DUKWs and landing craft were continuously operating. With traditional bridging, such a crossing would have required shutting down military traffic on a critical bridge. The success of the Rhine crossing accelerated the end of the European war by an estimated 3 weeks, according to post-war analysis. This acceleration came not from the mere fact of crossing, but from the speed and breadth of the operation enabled by amphibious vehicles. Traditional doctrine would have required sequential operations, establish small bridgeheads, build bridges under fire, reinforce gradually, then break out after supply buildup. This process, even if successful, would have taken 2 to 3 weeks minimum. German forces would have had time to establish new defensive lines, destroy infrastructure, potentially negotiate. Instead, the Allies achieved in 72 hours what German planning assumed would take weeks. By March 26th, 3 Allied armies were racing into Germany's interior. The Ruhr was encircled. By April 1st, the speed of advance prevented Germans from destroying factories, bridges, supplies that might have prolonged resistance. General Omar Bradley calculated the lives saved. If we'd had to cross the Rhine the traditional way, assault boats, engineers building bridges under fire, gradual reinforcement, we'd have lost 50,000 men minimum, he said. The DUKWs turned what should have been a bloodbath into a transportation exercise. The strategic impact rippled eastward. Soviet forces, learning of the crossing's success, accelerated their own operations toward Berlin, not wanting Western allies to capture the Nazi capital. The race between East and West that would shape post-war Europe was intensified by DUKWs crossing the Rhine. By March 28th, the German command structure in the West had effectively disintegrated. Communications broke down as headquarters retreated or were overrun. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces divided and trapped in the Ruhr pocket. His final order, issued March 29th, revealed despair. "The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Rhine," he wrote. "Further resistance only increases suffering. I release all soldiers from their oath. Save yourselves as best you can." Model committed suicide on April 21st rather than surrender. The psychological collapse was complete. Wehrmacht soldiers, who had fought tenaciously for every German village, now surrendered in masses. The Rhine had held mythic significance. Its loss meant the war was truly over. Civilian morale, already shattered by bombing, collapsed completely. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that no natural barrier could protect Germany. If the Rhine could be crossed in 3 days, what was the point of continued resistance? Local officials began negotiating surrender of their towns to avoid destruction. Hans Frank, Nazi governor of Poland wrote in his diary, "The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our fate, it is gone. We face not defeat but annihilation." The Rhine crossing fundamentally changed military thinking about amphibious operations. Prior to March 1945, amphibious assault was primarily associated with seaborne invasions, Normandy, Pacific island hopping. The Rhine demonstrated that amphibious capabilities were equally decisive in continental warfare. The U.S. Army's official history concluded the mass employment of DUKWs at the Rhine represents a revolution in military affairs equivalent to the introduction of armor in World War I. The ability to treat water obstacles as highways, rather than barriers, fundamentally alters operational planning. Soviet observers attached to Allied headquarters took careful notes. A colonel named Ivan Yakushin reported to Moscow, "The Americans have solved the problem of river crossing through industrial mass production. They simply built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers become irrelevant." This has implications for any future conflict in Europe. The British Army conducted extensive studies. A brigadier named Richard Goodbody wrote, "We must never again assume that water barriers provide significant defensive advantage against an enemy with proper amphibious equipment." The Rhine crossing proves that industrial capacity trumps geographic advantage. While generals claimed credit, the true heroes were DUKW crews who made it possible. These men, many from Navy detachments, found themselves in the middle of Germany, operating what amounted to floating targets. A seaman named Joseph Bernardini described a typical crossing. "You're driving this big, slow target across 1,300 feet of open water," he said. "German 88s are shooting at you, mortars dropping around you, machine guns trying to find range. You can't zigzag much or the current takes you. You just grip the wheel, push the throttle, and pray." Maintenance crews performed miracles keeping DUKWs operational, working under fire, often in darkness, repairing hull breaches, replacing propellers damaged by debris, keeping engines running despite being soaked with Rhine water. A master sergeant named Thomas Riley reported, "We were patching holes with anything we could find. Ration cans hammered flat, chunks of German armor plate, even wooden plugs. If it floated and moved, we kept it running." British DUKW operators added their own innovations. A sergeant major named William Davies developed a technique for using DUKWs to rescue crews from knocked-out tanks. "We'd drive right up to burning tanks, use our vehicle as a shield, and pull wounded tankers aboard," he said. "The water dripping from our hull helped with the heat. Saved dozens of lads that way." After the war, German military professionals conducted exhaustive studies of their defeat. The Rhine crossing featured prominently as a failure of imagination as much as material. General Franz Halder, former Chief of General Staff, wrote in 1948, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Rhine crossing. We positioned our reserves, registered our artillery, prepared demolitions. We did everything correctly according to our doctrine. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river's existence." The Wehrmacht's final operational study, completed by imprisoned German officers in 1946, admitted, "The American deployment of amphibious vehicles in mass represents a form of warfare we neither anticipated nor could counter with available resources. Even had we known, German industry could not have produced comparable numbers." The Rhine crossing was lost in Detroit's factories, not on the Rhine's banks. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored warfare, offered perhaps the most insightful observation. "We Germans perfected the art of warfare," he said. "The Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Rhine, business defeated art." Their swimming trucks were not elegant, not sophisticated, but they were numerous and effective. That is the American way of war. Despite its decisive impact, the DUKW's role has been largely overshadowed by more dramatic events. The capture of the Remagen Bridge, the massive airborne operation, Montgomery's set-piece battle, Yet veterans understood the amphibious truck's true significance. General Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, wrote, "Analysts will debate what shortened the war most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure, or Allied unity. I believe historians underestimate the simple DUKW. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground." With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday. The DUKWs continued serving after the Rhine, crossing the Elbe, the Danube, dozens of smaller rivers. They evacuated concentration camp survivors too weak to walk, transported food to starving civilians in isolated areas. The vehicles that had broken Germany's last barrier became instruments of humanitarian relief. A technical sergeant named Paul Morrison recalled using his DUKW after Germany's surrender. Same vehicle that crossed the Rhine under fire was now delivering food to German kids in flooded areas near Hamburg, he said. They'd never seen anything like it, a truck that could swim. Kids would chase us, calling out, "Swim wagon, swim wagon." Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives after it. The 21,000 DUKWs produced during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They embodied American industrial philosophy. While German engineers pursued perfection in small numbers, American manufacturers pursued adequacy in overwhelming quantity. This philosophy extended beyond DUKWs. The same factories producing amphibious trucks were turning out 2.5-ton trucks at the rate of 10,000 per month. The steel for DUKW hulls came from mills producing Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines were built on assembly lines that could shift from truck engines to aircraft engines to tank engines with minimal retooling. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, visited a DUKW assembly line in 1944 and observed, "In 1 hour, I watched them complete 6 DUKWs, each one imperfect by German standards. Rough welds, simple solutions, painted olive drab. But each one would cross the Rhine." German factories would spend a month building one perfect amphibious vehicle. We built 180 good-enough ones in that time. The German Landwasserschlepper, by comparison, revealed the limitations of the craft production approach. Each one required specialized workers, custom components, extensive testing. When Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, production ceased entirely. A missing component meant no vehicle. American DUKW production simply substituted alternate parts and continued. The Rhine crossing success reverberated through the final weeks of the war. German units throughout the Reich learned that the Western Allies had crossed the last barrier with ease. Morale, already fragile, shattered completely. In Italy, German forces that had held mountain positions for months suddenly began withdrawing. Field Marshal Kesselring reported, "News of the Rhine crossing caused immediate deterioration in troop morale. Soldiers ask, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? I have no answer." German forces in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, bypassed but still dangerous, began negotiating local surrenders. The myth of the impregnable Rhine had sustained hope for negotiated peace. Its fall in 72 hours made continued resistance pointless. Even in Berlin, besieged by Soviet forces, the Rhine crossing had impact. Hitler's final recorded military conference on April 27th included his lament. "The Rhine was lost because we didn't anticipate their amphibious capabilities," he said. "We prepared for the wrong war." It was perhaps his only accurate military assessment of the entire conflict. At a 1985 reunion of Rhine crossing veterans in Lexington, Kentucky, aging soldiers gathered to remember those 3 days that ended Nazi Germany's last hope. The DUKWs, a few preserved as monuments, drew particular attention. A former sergeant named James Mitchell, who commanded a DUKW, stood beside one of the preserved vehicles. "Ugly thing, isn't it?" he said. "Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something neither. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them, we outproduced them, out-innovated them, out-imagined them." A former German soldier named Hans Müller, who had defended the Rhine with the 181st Infantry Division, attended as an invited guest. His speech to the veterans was powerful. "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle," he said. "We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Rhine, I knew the war was over. Not lost, over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway." The reunion highlighted a profound truth. The Rhine crossing succeeded not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through industrial capacity channeled through innovation. The heroes were as much the assembly line workers in Pontiac as the soldiers in Germany. March 23 to 26, 1945, marked more than a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, of mass production over craft perfection, of pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine. The DUKW itself was quintessentially American, not the best amphibious vehicle possible, but the best that could be mass-produced with existing technology. It solved problems through quantity rather than quality, through standardization rather than specialization. It was operated by citizen soldiers with minimal training rather than professional warriors with years of experience. This approach horrified German military professionals. General von Rundstedt in British captivity complained, "War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war, but products of industry. You defeated us not on the battlefield but in the factory." Yet this transformation was precisely the point. America had democratized warfare just as it had democratized production. The DUKW represented not just military capability, but industrial ideology. The belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient production properly organized. The final accounting of the Rhine crossing operation reveals the DUKW's decisive impact. Hundreds of DUKWs in direct Rhine crossing operations, 600 British Buffalo tractors in support, over 2,000 DUKWs available in theater. Germany had produced approximately 100 Landwasserschleppers with few operational. Between March 23 and 31, 1945, over 15,000 troops were transported across, 1,200 vehicles carried over, 3,000 tons of supplies delivered, 2,000 wounded evacuated, more than 5,000 individual DUKW crossings completed. America had manufactured 21,000 DUKWs and over 500,000 standard trucks sharing DUKW components. Each DUKW cost about $10,000. Each German vehicle cost 75,000 Reichsmarks, a 7-to-1 cost ratio favoring American production with infinite advantage in actual deployment. The DUKW had gone from concept to prototype in 38 days. The Rhine defenses fell in 72 hours. The war was shortened by an estimated 3 weeks. 50,000 Allied casualties were prevented. The DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine transcended its immediate military impact. It demonstrated that technological surprise could be achieved not through secret weapons, but through mass deployment of capabilities enemies dismissed as insignificant. Post-war military doctrine incorporated the Rhine lessons. NATO war plans during the Cold War emphasized amphibious vehicles for crossing Eastern Europe's many rivers. The Soviet Union developed entire families of amphibious vehicles learning from American success. Modern military forces consider river crossing capability essential rather than specialized. Beyond military implications, the Rhine crossing validated American production philosophy. Quality mattered less than quantity if the quantity was sufficient. Perfection mattered less than availability. Sophistication mattered less than reliability. These lessons shaped post-war American industry far beyond military applications. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, reflected DUKW philosophy, massive standardized aid rather than customized solutions. The interstate highway system applied military logistics lessons to civilian infrastructure. The space race emphasized reliable, mass-produced components over handcrafted perfection. Perhaps the DUKW's greatest contribution was psychological. German soldiers and civilians witnessed American forces treating the sacred Rhine like a minor inconvenience. This casual demonstration of industrial might did more to convince Germans of defeat's inevitability than any propaganda could achieve. Post-war interviews with German civilians revealed consistent themes. They expected Americans to be stopped at the Rhine for weeks or months, giving time for miracle weapons or negotiations. Instead, Americans crossed in 3 days using vehicles Germans didn't know existed in such numbers. The shock was profound and lasting. A woman named Elizabeth Becker, who lived near Wesel, recalled, "We heard the artillery on March 23rd, terrible thunder all night. We expected weeks of battle. On March 26th, American trucks were driving past our home still wet from crossing. My father, a veteran of the Great War, saw them and said, 'When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over.' He was right." This psychological collapse accelerated German acceptance of defeat and occupation. Resistance movements that might have emerged never materialized. The demonstration of American industrial capacity at the Rhine convinced Germans that resistance was futile, not from military defeat, but from technological obsolescence. Winston Churchill, who had personally crossed the Rhine during the operation, offered perhaps the most eloquent assessment in his war memoirs. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 marked not merely the breach of Germany's last barrier, but the triumph of a new form of warfare, he wrote. The Americans with their amphibious trucks had solved through industry what we Europeans attempted through strategy. They didn't defeat the Rhine, they ignored it. I watched those ungainly vehicles, part boat, part truck, wholly effective, streaming across waters that had protected Germany since Rome's legions. Each DUKW was a messenger of doom for Nazi Germany, carrying not just soldiers, but proof of American industrial supremacy. In my long life, I have witnessed many military innovations: the machine gun, the tank, the aircraft, but few impressed me as much as those simple swimming trucks at the Rhine. They represented not technological brilliance, but organizational genius. Not German-style perfectionism, but American-style pragmatism. When I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 25, 1945, watching DUKWs emerge from the river like primordial beasts evolving from sea to land, I knew I was witnessing not just the end of the war, but the beginning of the American century. On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at T-Bauenturn's. Rhymes. Among the factors he cited for Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected, amphibious capabilities at the Rhine. This admission buried in longer explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure revealed the crossing's true impact. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander allocated significant credit to the DUKW. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck, he wrote. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from limitation into advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine occurred on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender. It carried not soldiers, but food supplies for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that had broken Germany's last military barrier had become an instrument of humanitarian relief. A private named Anthony DeMarco, driving that last DUKW, recalled, "No shooting, no artillery, just driving across like it was a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those ducks did. Turned the impossible into routine, enemies into people needing help." The Rhine crossing of March 1945 stands as a watershed moment in military history, not for its tactical brilliance or strategic importance alone, but for what it represented about the changing nature of warfare. The DUKW, ungainly, unarmored, unremarkable, had rendered irrelevant a barrier that had protected Germany for 2 millennia. German defenders prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine. They never conceived that American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers irrelevant. They prepared for the wrong war not through incompetence, but through inability to imagine American productive capacity. The Rhine wasn't conquered, it was industrially obsoleted. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Rhine between March 23 and 31, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that American mass production could transform warfare's fundamental assumptions. Every German soldier who watched a DUKW drive up the Rhine's eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional military limitations. Field Marshal Montgomery summarized the operation with uncharacteristic brevity. "We didn't assault the Rhine," he said. "We commuted across it." This transformation of the extraordinary into the mundane, the impossible into the routine, was the DUKW's true victory. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity properly applied could achieve what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks produced on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were correct in their pre-war assessment. The Rhine could not be crossed against determined resistance using traditional methods. They simply never imagined that American industry would make traditional methods obsolete. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 didn't just transport soldiers. They carried the future of warfare, where industrial might would trump geographic advantage, where mass production would defeat craft perfection, where pragmatic innovation would overwhelm rigid doctrine. The Rhine crossing's true lesson was not military, but industrial. In the 20th century's total wars, victory belonged not to the best soldiers, but to the best factories. The German defenders never knew Americans had amphibious trucks to cross the Rhine, not because of intelligence failure, but because they couldn't conceive such plenty. That conceptual blindness, more than any tactical error, doomed the Third Reich's last stand at Germany's sacred river. The memories of World War II remind us not only of the price of freedom, but of the strength of the human spirit. Let us preserve their stories so they are never forgotten. Please subscribe to help keep these memories alive.